So I want to share and kind of walk through an ethical dilemma that does relate to kind of some of these legal obligations that we're talking about. I'm going to kind of walk through it using the Barsky's model. Um, this one is directly related to an experience that I had. I think I may have shared this with my individual when you guys took individuals and families, or when a large majority of you did. So I apologize if this is a duplicate or the story is familiar, but it will be different because I will be talking through kind of even though at the time I wasn't aware that I was using the Barsky's model. I don't know if I did it perfectly. I can kind of show how we utilize similar steps to kind of come to a conclusion and process through, like, what is our obligation to the client and his rights, and what are our obligations to the profession and safety and just liability reasons. So, excuse me, I'm not going to use the individual's name. I'm just going to call him the client. So I was working with this client. I had first provided case management services for him while he was at our clinic. He saw a case manager, therapist, and a psychiatrist. And so my first point of contact with him was when I was his case manager. And so client's diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder. So if that's not a super familiar disorder, it's kind of a marriage of a schizophrenia and a mood disorder. And so you'll have the psychotic symptoms coupled with depression typically, and sometimes anxiety. And so he definitely had auditory hallucinations, not super med compliant, but pretty stable. He was one who came in once a month. He avoided seeing his therapist. He really liked working with me. And so I had to limit case management because he didn't really have any needs. He wanted to find a job and go to school. And then his level of acuity didn't really necessitate more than seeing me for a month. Then early on, I probably knew him for maybe 6 months or so. We had gotten a call that he had attempted to commit suicide. He had ran his car into a tree and ended up breaking his pelvis. He was at, I think, Mary Freebed. He was somewhere. He was in the hospital because he had broke significant parts of his body. Or he broke his hip, not his pelvis. So he had to do rehab. He was very symptomatic at the time. And so the course of action that we took was he was petitioned through the courts to have to go to inpatient psychiatric treatment. While there, they gave him a court-ordered treatment. So usually that's for 90 days. Where he has to comply with all treatment recommendations. And so we were recommending therapy, case management, medication compliance. And if he did not follow through on those, he would have to return to the psych hospital for further evaluation. And so he discharged. He was compliant, begrudgingly, so he was not on board. He had very limited insight into his symptoms. And so he came out. He was stabilized. The medication actually worked very well. He was able to articulate kind of what happened. The voices were telling him he had to save the children. And so his suicide attempt wasn't necessarily to end his life, but it was kind of like a martyrdom type thing. So he stabilized. He was doing really well. We didn't extend his court order. So you have the option when a client has a court order, when it's expiring, to petition to extend it for a year. It's very rare, at least in my experience. So we didn't find the need to because he was engaging while he was taking his medications. Well, because he was doing well, had insight, he believed he was cured. So why would he need to continue taking medications? It was a very logical for his reality. And so he stopped taking his medications. He didn't like how it felt. A lot of times there's sexual side effects with some of the antipsychotics that tend to be a deterrent. So he stopped taking his medication, started disengaging from services. We get called again with another suicide attempt, this time with his mom in the car. Kind of mirrored his previous attempt, kind of the same religious kind of thoughts and ideations that led him to do it. So at this point, we have noticed a very strong pattern of behaviors, and so we did the same kind of thing where we put him on a court order, went to the hospital, but this time we required an injectable antipsychotic, and so often that will happen with, we'll prescribe an injection of the antipsychotic, because then you don't have to worry about compliance daily. You have to worry about them coming in for shots, and usually, depending on the dose, depending on the client, how new they are to the medication, anywhere from every 2 weeks to a month. And so we started him on the antipsychotic injection plus the continued services. And again, we saw the same thing where he would improve, develop some insight, think he was fine. But we were very, very nervous about what to do next and kind of his vulnerabilities. So this is kind of where the ethical dilemma came in. He did not like the injection, and it's not for everybody. The side effects aren't necessarily great. You can get tremors, you get tardive dyskinesia where you're got like the dry mouth and the tremors, and it's not super fun, and he was experiencing some of those, and so he didn't want anything to do with that. So this is kind of where we had to step in and figure out our course of action. So step one in Barsky's model is to kind of identify what the ethical issue is. And for me, where I wrestled with was self-determination for a client. Like, this is his life. He was in his 20s. He had a lot of goals. He wanted to go back to college. He so desperately wanted a girlfriend and have a relationship and get married. He was an uncle, and his nieces adored him. So he had all of these things that he perceived being on this antipsychotic injection, and even medications in general, were preventing him from being able to meet his very reasonable goals for a 20-some-year-old dude. And so we had this value of self-determination for the client, but then we also had this value and kind of legal obligation to protecting our client, who we clinically assessed, or I clinically assessed, as not having, kind of having impaired judgment and limited insight into the illness. And so that's kind of where the issue came in. Like, do we play our hand because we're in a position of power and require him to be on this court order for a year where he'd have to take injections for a year, come to therapy at least once a week, and so that's transportation, where he didn't have a car because he crashed his car, and I'm trying to remember if he got his license taken away, but anyways, he'd have to come up to the office twice a week. It interfered with his schedule, interfered with X, Y, and Z. Or do we do this because when he's on his medication, he actually has insight, and he hadn't had a known attempt while medically compliant? So we unintentionally, because again, I wasn't like, let's pull out the Barskys and follow it. This was just kind of what we, in hindsight now looking back, that was the ethical issue that we were facing and addressing. So the places that we went to where I went to, because at that time I had transitioned to his, I had spent time as his therapist because I'd moved into that position and he wanted to continue working with me. So I was his therapist, and then I actually transitioned into the clinical supervisor for the clinic. And so I was the person that his therapist came and consulted to. And so then I went ahead and consulted with my supervisor, just to kind of make sure we were legally covering our bases. Consulted with his therapist because she was seeing him weekly for this duration of his 90-day court order, his case manager, his psychiatrist as well. And we actually pulled in some other psychiatrists as well to kind of talk about, like, are there other options for him to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was not a decision that was made solely by his therapist or solely made by myself as like the clinical site manager. We also had to have a psychiatrist on board if we wanted to extend it, because it's a really involved process. It's seriously, and a lot of psychiatrists will just say no based on the fact that, like, they may have to go testify in the court, and that takes away from their very busy schedule, et cetera, et cetera. So consulted with everybody to kind of, we identified that those were the most appropriate people. I think we pulled in corporate compliance as well, just to kind of have that as like an agency support outside of just our clinic. So thinking critically around the situation, we really had to figure out like if we upheld self-determination, what would happen? If we forced it, what was happening? Really had to wrestle through like what was the least harm to the client. Taking away self-determination obviously really hurts, like that dignity and pride and kind of that like paternalism of having like this power dynamic where we're telling him what to do. It just feels icky. I don't like it. And with his diagnosis, there were some delusions that didn't necessarily have him looking at the situation in what we would perceive as a rational manner. And so we kind of had to wrestle through all of that. And ultimately, we decided that the least harm would be for us to continue the order. We were actually all in agreement with that. So that managing conflict piece, we didn't really have to do. We did have to manage it a little bit with his mom, who she eventually became his guardian, because at that point, he just wasn't making decisions that were of sound mind. And so we had to get her on board as well, which that was kind of difficult because having a mom acknowledge that her son is this mentally ill and taking those rights away from him, that doesn't feel good as well. There is still some layers of denial and education that had to occur for mom. But ultimately, we decided that this is what we wanted to do. So we had to make sure that we were complying as well. So if we're talking about planning and implementing our decision, the therapist had to be consistent in following up with him if he missed. We had to be responsible that if he didn't come in for his injection for a prolonged period of time, obviously sometimes people miss because life happens, that if he didn't comply with treatment, he would have to go back to the psych hospital. So we were responsible for like a lot of follow-up and management, because if we were requiring this of him and went through everything, we had to do our part to make sure that we were delivering appropriate services. So we did that. He did his full year. He remained very stable. He was compliant. Sometimes we had to track him down to come in, or like actually physically go find him and bring him in for his injection. But overall, he was compliant for the year. And at the end of the year, we did not renew the order because at that point, we didn't really have clinical justification for it because he was complying and he was agreeing. Well, shortly after his order ended, he determined that he wanted to go move in with his sister down in Texas. And so this was a decision that was supported by his mom, who is the guardian. His sister was willing. We felt very, very uncomfortable with this because we knew a large part of his stability and follow through with services was because we were tracking him down and holding him accountable and really investing in him. And we knew his history, and we worried that if he went down there, he wouldn't have that same level of support, and he wouldn't have a mental health provider that would be able to know it, because at first we missed it all until he decompensated to the point of acting out on his suicidal ideations. But at that point, because we ended the order and his guardian was on board, we had to let him go. And so we did all we could to coordinate with the CMH, so Community Mental Health in the county he was moving, gave his sister all the resources, and just kind of crossed our fingers that it would turn out positive. And unfortunately, less than a year after moving down there, he ended up completing suicide because he never engaged in mental health services. And so and that part still gets me. It's really it's my only client who's ever successfully followed through. And I knew him well enough that that's a whole other piece. And I'm close on my 15 minutes of video recording. So if we were to evaluate our decision, if we made the right decision, obviously the outcome showed that there was a really strong need to override some of that self-determination that we were wrestling with for the sake and safety of the client. Obviously, when we had self-determination, it ended in a way that we were not hoping for, but ultimately that's what he chose to follow through on. So I don't know if that helps a little bit kind of walk through. Again, like, it's not always like a conscious or doing X, Y, and Z, but it does kind of give a framework for being able to address something that we'd have legal risk